Hello Spartans, this is Bruno from the future. While editing the video for next week, I've realized that it is quite extensive. I have decided to split it in two parts, and this is the first one. Some of the things you will hear me saying during the video may not make much sense without these as context. I hope you enjoy watching the video as much as I enjoyed creating it. Let's begin. I have received many comments and direct messages asking whether a particular university's degree can pave the way into the field of cybersecurity. Usually, I tend to simply glance over the syllabus and give a thumbs up or down. As this question arises frequently, I have decided to present a decision-making framework that I usually share with my clients. This way, you can independently decide if investing your time and money in a specific degree is worthwhile. I am located in Prague with a degree taken in Portugal, so it makes little sense for me to look at American universities and pick specific degrees and paths. At the same time, I joined a classic brick-and-mortar university back in Portugal, and things have changed over the years to a point where now people can take full online degrees or combine online with brick-and-mortar university degrees. My point with this video is not to help you optimize your time and money or even give you a list of degrees that you should take, as I want this video to be country agnostic. My goal is to give you a yardstick so you can then decide if a degree is right for you. My framework takes a top-down approach with the following layers: red and blue teams, logical abstractions, assets and entities, and finally fundamentals and subjects. This time I will leverage CyberSpartan slides to guide you. Now it is time for me to move myself to the corner. Okay, it seems that the slides are missing. Let's try again. That's much better. The concept of red and blue team was originally coined by the military and used during simulations. It has since been adapted to the realm of cybersecurity for similar purposes. The red team represents attackers, while the blue team represents defenders. This divide represents a good starting point for our framework. We start with red teams. And at a high level, red teams can be divided in two categories. The first one is pen testers, while the second one is red teamers. Some of you may be confused because I'm basically saying that red teamers are a subset of red teamers. It is important to understand that red and blue is simply a terminology to distinguish between attackers and defenders. As with the military, you have different sub-teams within a team which have different targets and goals. Pen testers usually focus on a target or a small subset of targets. As an example, a web application or perhaps a network. And their goal is to find as many vulnerabilities as possible. Red teamers, on the other hand, have specific goals and targets, and they don't really bother with enumerating all possible vulnerabilities. Pen testing engagements usually last between a few days to a few weeks, while red teaming engagements can go as far as several months. Pen testers look for vulnerabilities, while red teamers focus on simulating a real-life attack to test the security posture of the entire company, or at least a segment of it. The skills of both sub-teams may overlap, and here I list most, if not all of them. We have adversarial simulation, social engineering, physical security testing, network security testing, application security testing, and finally malware and exploit development. We started with red team and now it's time for blue team. And starting from the top, we have application security, we have network security, security operations, cloud security, digital forensics and incident response, threat research and malware analysis, threat intelligence, vulnerability research, and finally governance, risk, and compliance. Now I have listed red team skills at a higher level, but to clarify things further, let's resort to the well-established Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. This framework or chain enumerates the most common steps taken by an attacker to compromise a target. During the first step, called reconnaissance, the attacker collects as much information as possible about an infrastructure or a specific victim. This information can be obtained using a combination of web and network scans, crawling web networks either manually or automatically, and even email harvesting. The objective of this phase is understanding as much as possible about the target infrastructure or perhaps the victim. Now the next three steps, weaponization, delivery, and exploitation, differ from target to target. And the exploitation phase may actually never happen. But let's imagine a specific example. Suppose that an attacker wants to target an individual and infect his machine. In this case, the weaponization phase would consist of preparing for instance, a malicious Word document with macros. This malicious document would execute a PowerShell command that would download malware from a remote server and install it on the machine. The delivery phase would be grabbing this malicious document and send it to the victim using, say, email. In this case, there is no exploitation, and once the victim would open the document, we would move instantly to the installation phase of the cyberkill chain. But let's imagine another scenario. Let's imagine that an attacker wants to break into an infrastructure by exploiting a publicly exposed and vulnerable web application. In this case, the payload would consist of an exploit and malicious code that would either drop the malware or perhaps download it from a remote server and deploy it on the compromised machine. In this case, the delivery would consist of sending or uploading this payload to the web application somehow using some form or some other method that the attacker deemed to be vulnerable. Regardless of the situation, the installation phase tends to be valid because the installation phase is when the malware is deployed on the machine. And as we know, one of the best ways for an attacker to get foothold on the machine is by deploying malware, even though these days attackers find other means to establish presence on the machine that don't require malware. A piece of malware is useless unless it connects back to a command and control server. And the command and control server is basically a remote server controlled by an attacker. This is the command and control phase or C2 phase of the cyberkill chain. And finally, we have actions and objectives. Now, this step of the chain differs once more from attack to attack. The attacker may want to establish footholds on a victim's machine and exfiltrate confidential files, or they may want to break into a larger infrastructure and get to a database or perhaps to a domain controller. Once an attacker has remote control of the machine, the attacker can execute the commands that he wants and he can move laterally to other machines and other services within the infrastructure. Understanding the cyberkill chain is a must for any cybersecurity professional worth its salt. But some of you may be wondering, why am I talking about the cyberkill chain in the context of this framework? The reason is quite simple, because if you look at each one of the phases, you can understand what are the skills that you require to accomplish each one of them. This is especially important if you are a red teamer, but if you flip the tables, this still makes sense for blue teamers. In this case, I'm going to focus on red team only, and starting with reconnaissance, you need to understand how to use open source intelligence, how to perform email harvesting, and how to automate web crawling so that you can collect as much information about the target as possible. And this includes information from social media. Moving on to weaponization, delivery, exploitation, installation, and command and control, you need to be able to develop malware and leverage evasion techniques to bypass security solutions and email filters. Building malware is in and of itself a skill that requires knowledge of distributed systems, operating systems, and network protocols. At the end of the day, malware is nothing more than an evil distributed application that suffers from similar limitations and leverages similar technologies as legitimate applications. Depending on how fancy you want to be, you may design, build, and deploy your custom exploits against publicly exposed applications. It turns out that knowing how to program is actually a skill that you should have as a cybersecurity professional. But who would have thought? And finally, with actions and objectives, you must have a good understanding not only of operating systems, but also of networks and infrastructures in general, such as cloud infrastructures. Once you have a foothold on the target, you either need to act on the target, for instance, exfiltrate files, or pivot to another target in the network. Now, the good news is that nowadays, many social engineering, exploitation, and post-exploitation frameworks abstract all of this. So for the most part, you don't really have to worry about all of these steps and components, and you can simply focus on your objectives. However, understanding how these tools operate and what they accomplish will enable you to be much more stealthy and effective. There is a major reason why understanding the tooling and background operations matters. Suppose that you are conducting a DNS brute force to find host names belonging to a company. To remain stealthy, you might use a tool that employs open resolvers to distribute the resolution load and conceal your tracks. And did I mention that I actually have a tool that does exactly this, and this tool is called Golem, and I will link it in the description. But suppose that the developer of the tool that you are using fumbled the script and forgot to utilize the open resolvers. Suddenly you have been exposed because you have trusted blindly a tool. Now, as I mentioned in my video, Avoiding the Expert's Trap, which I will link in the description once more, Certain fields have evolved into a combination of multiple disciplines. Fields like cryptography and identity and access management, or IAM, have dedicated personnel in some companies. But that isn't always the norm. Security engineers or even cloud security engineers now are responsible for handling these responsibilities. Moreover, roles such as security engineering or even cloud security engineering are in essence the same for companies that leverage the cloud to run most of their operations. Now, if you are good at spotting patterns, you have probably realized that red and blue teams are two sides of the same coin. At the same time, the areas and sub-areas of these high-level categories operate on similar assets, but from different perspectives. As an example, a security engineer or a blue teamer hardens a server while the red teamer breaks into it. Speaking of servers, let's move on to the next layer: logical abstractions, assets, and entities. In order for you to understand the red and blue team layer, you need to understand the components that sit below. I divide these in three categories: logical abstractions, assets, and entities. Now, logical abstractions include things like operating systems and firmware, applications such as web and mobile applications or desktop applications, data, files, databases, blob storages, programming languages and data structures, virtual machines, authentication and authorization systems, binaries and scripts, and finally, cloud infrastructure. Now, when I talk about cloud infrastructure, I mean the layer that is built on top of hardware, which includes software and firmware. All of the logical abstractions are built on top of something, and this something is what I call assets. And some examples of assets include laptops, mobile devices, servers, IoT devices, routers and network devices, firewalls, card readers, and physical security systems. Now, it is worth noting that assets cannot be decoupled entirely from their inherent logical abstractions. As an example, a firewall that sits inside a router is a combination of hardware, software, and firmware. The point of this separation is simply to highlight the difference between software and hardware. There is one last component missing, which I call entities. And entities include people, processes, psychology, social dynamics, trust relationships. Now, the first time I wrote these slides, I only put people as entities. But later I realized that people are much more complex than that. People have processes, they have trust relationships amongst themselves. And they have many psychology triggers and biases that can be leveraged by a crafty hacker or red teamer. Now, in tech, these entities are usually abstracted using concepts such as users, groups, roles, etc. Now, each of these has privileges, and these privileges tend to reflect real-world hierarchies. As an example, an IT administrator, which tends to be the most senior person on an IT team, tends to have administrative privileges over certain applications or services used by the company. All the points under entities are closely related, and some of them even overlap. Entities are a relevant part of this model because technology is built by people for people, and people tend to be the weakest link in the security chain. Social engineering is a reality, and this will make more sense later in this video. And that is it for today, Spartans. This marks the first part of a two-part series on my framework for assessing the quality of a university curriculum. In the next video, I will reveal the necessary fundamentals and subjects, so stay tuned. Until next time, stay safe, stay paranoid.